Okay, we're going to talk about fallacies of ambiguity here. And we basically got 4 more left, all right? There's 2 fallacies of ambiguity, and then there are 2 fallacies of grammatical analogy, okay? So let's talk about ambiguity. These kind of fallacies arise because of some kind of ambiguity in either the premises or the conclusion or both. If an expression is susceptible to different interpretations in a given context, or when the conclusion on the argument of an argument depends on the shift in meaning of an ambiguous word or phrase, or on the wrong interpretation of an ambiguous statement, then the argument commits the fallacy of ambiguity. And I kind of have to correct myself. I think on the last video I said we're dealing with the fallacies of amphiboly, but they are the fallacies of ambiguity, and I have 2 examples, and one of the examples under the fallacy of ambiguity is called the fallacy of amphiboly. Okay? Alright, so really what these are about is that often if you misinterpret one of the premises, or there's a word that can make a shift in meaning, equivocate, it reads the same but it has a different meaning and a different meaning is meant, well, this affects what you can get from those premises to the conclusion. This will also affect what conclusion you come up with. So all of this will make a lot more sense. But if you have an argument where something's ambiguous, then it can mess up the whole line of reasoning, okay? So equivocation, this is an important one to be aware of. And equivocation, let's write down here, it means equal voice, different meaning, okay? It sounds the same, but the meaning is different. Equal voice, equivocation, that's where that's coming from. It occurs when the conclusion of an argument depends on the fact that a word or phrase is used, either explicitly or implicitly, in 2 different senses in the argument. Such arguments are either invalid, like if you have a word and it changes meaning, you can mess up the skeleton or argument form. If it was an argument that dealt with a skeleton and the same terms being used throughout in the places it's supposed to be, if you change the meaning of a word, you've actually introduced another term into the skeleton, and it can mess everything up. So it can make an argument invalid, or it can turn, it can mess up premises. Even if an argument isn't dependent on form, if you shift the meaning of a word, then whatever flow was going on is lost. In either case, they're unsound. So here I'll give you some examples. Some triangles are obtuse. Whatever is obtuse is ignorant. Therefore, some triangles are ignorant. Okay, the word that's equivocating is obtuse. Obtuse here and obtuse there. Equal voice. They sound the same, but you can see they mean something different here. Some triangles are obtuse, and I don't know geometry. At least I've had one in a class in high school. But I think this means if an angle's past 90 degrees. At least that's what a student told me. Okay, this is a term meaningful in geometry. Here, whatever is obtuse is ignorant. This is a term that's very meaningful when you're talking about intellectual capabilities or what someone knows, I guess, here. So you can see when these 2 words equivocate, therefore some triangles are ignorant, well, that doesn't follow, okay? Triangles aren't ignorant. They can be obtuse, but not ignorant, okay? So there's a clear, basic example of equivocation. All right, here's one. Any law can be repealed by the legislative authority. But the law of gravity is a law, therefore the law of gravity can be repealed by the legislative authority. Well, law can be repealed by legislative authority. This means legislative law, right? Legislative type of law. Okay, but the law of gravity is a law. Here you're talking about a physical law, right? Okay, so law is equivocating. One's a legislative law, the other is a physical, natural law. Therefore, the law of gravity can be repealed by the legislative authority. Because of the equivocation of the word law, the conclusion does not follow. Okay, here, we have a duty to do what is right, and we have a right to speak out in defense of the innocent. Therefore, we have a duty to speak out in defense of the innocent. Okay, what is equivocating here? the word right is. We have a duty to do what is right, and this is talking, right, the term right there is talking about moral right, okay? And then it says we have a right to speak out in the defense of the innocent. This here is talking about a constitutional right, right? So equal voice, but right means two different things here. Moral right and wrong. Here, the fact that you have a constitutional right to speak out in defense of the innocent. But because of the equivocation, we can't get from these two things. We have a duty to speak out in defense of the innocent. Because there's a lot of protests. People will show up at a courthouse, right, and they will protest against a perceived injustice. Do the police ever come to your house and arrest you because you were not there exercising your constitutional right to speak out in the defense of the innocent? No. So you don't have a duty in the sense that you have one here to do what is moral right. The only way to make this argument really work, because right now the conclusion doesn't follow, is you have to have something in there that says, any constitutional right has to first be a moral duty, something like that, okay? If you had, we always have a duty to do what is right, and any constitutional right we have, we've made it a constitutional right because we felt it was a moral right and our duty. Then from there, I suppose you could say, if you were going to write down an argument, we have a duty to speak out in defense of the innocent. But you get the point here. Right here and right here, there's equivocation. They mean two completely different things, so it's very hard to have a bridge between them, which is what the conclusion is doing, is trying to bridge the two together. We have a duty, therefore, to speak out in defense of the innocent. You can't get that from this. We have a duty to do what is right, but you don't have enough here to say we have a duty to exercise our constitutional rights. And the way our justice system and law is, it is not seen that you have a duty that you have to fulfill your constitutional rights, right? Nobody comes to your door, like I said, and arrests you for not being involved in a protest against injustice. Okay, here's another one here. A mouse is an animal. Therefore, a large mouse is a large animal. The equivocation is going on the word large here. A large mouse, I don't know, up to half a pound, a pound. So this is a large size for a small little rodent. This here is a large size for animals that weigh a lot more than mouse, a mouse does. So I don't know, you'd put like under a pound here, and this would be easily over a pound, but we're talking about mammals, elephants, horses, dogs, large dogs, stuff like that. So there's equivocation on the word large. Okay, let's go to fallacies. The fallacy of amphiboly. This occurs when the arguer misinterprets an ambiguous statement and then draws a conclusion based on this faulty interpretation. If there's evidence that, look, you've misinterpreted the premise, that's why you're coming up with this particular conclusion, which is erroneous or it's not the conclusion meant. The ambiguity usually occurs due to a poorly written argument that does not make its intended meaning clear. A careless arrangement of words. Okay, here's some examples. The tour guide said that standing in Greenwich Village, the Empire State Building could easily be seen. It follows that this Empire State Building is in Greenwich Village. Okay, now the Empire State Building is not in Greenwich Village. It's way over somewhere else. But what the proper interpretation of the first premise is that if you are standing in Greenwich Village, you can see the Empire State Building way over there that's not in Greenwich Village, right? But this, because you're misinterpreting this, someone's interpreting that the Empire State Building is in Greenwich Village, and so if you're standing there, you can see the building real easily, okay? You're misinterpreting a sentence. It's making you come to an erroneous conclusion right here, okay? Here's another one. John told Henry that he had made a mistake. It follows that John has at least the courage to admit his mistake. Now, if this is the way you interpret that, fine. But what if John is telling Henry that Henry is what he is referring to as made a mistake? Then this conclusion is not what was meant to be implied by the first statement. Okay? Here, I think I got another example here, two more. Professor Johnson said that he will give a lecture about heart failure in the biology lecture hall. It must be the case that a number of heart failures have occurred there recently. Okay, wrong conclusion because you're misinterpreting this statement here. Most likely what's meant is Professor Johnson's going to go to the biology lecture hall, and in that biology lecture hall he's going to be giving a lecture on heart attacks. He's not talking about that he's going to the biology lecture hall and talking about heart failures that happened in that room. Okay, so the there is, you're not to take it literally that heart attacks happened in the biology lecture room. The guy's going to the lecture hall and he's going to give a lecture on heart attacks. Okay, simple examples here. I think you're getting the point. Here's another one. Mrs. Hart stated in her will, I'll leave my 500-carat diamond necklace and my pet chinchilla to Alice and Teresa. Therefore, we conclude that Alice gets the necklace and Teresa gets the chinchilla. Now, if you're looking at a will, you certainly don't want to misinterpret this. Is that what she meant? Or does she mean that Alice and Teresa both get the 500-carat diamond necklace and are to take care of the pet, and both will enjoy both, and at worst you split the diamond ring 50-50 and you both are responsible for taking care of the dog? Okay, but based on a misinterpretation, this conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. Okay, so that's fallacies of ambiguity. You have two, equivocation and amphibole. Now let's finish off chapter 3 and talk about fallacies of grammatical analogy, and we have two. And these are arguments that commit fallacies that are grammatically analogous to other arguments that are good in every respect. Because of this similarity in linguistic structure, such fallacious arguments may appear good, yet be bad. So, what do they mean by grammatical analogy? I'll kind of reword this. Sometimes with these fallacies, if you do something in a certain way, it's a fallacy because you're not entitled to make this move, and you'll understand what I'm saying in a minute. But other times, the same kind of structure, you are entitled to make that move. So the moves you're making logically, or the reasoning you're using is identical, but in some cases you're allowed to do it and there's no fallacy, and in other cases you're doing the same type of reasoning move but you can't do it, it's not allowed, and it is a fallacy. So there's an analogy to the type of reasoning that you're going through, but you need to be careful. Sometimes you're allowed to do this and there is no fallacy, sometimes you can't do it because there is a fallacy. So this will all make sense here. Let's talk about the fallacy of composition. This is committed when the conclusion of an argument depends on the erroneous transference of an attribute from the parts of something to the whole. It is argued that because the parts have a certain attribute, it follows that the whole has that attribute too, and the situation is such that the attribute in question cannot be legitimately transferred from the parts to the whole. Sometimes you can look at attributes of the parts and attribute it to a whole. Fine. No fallacy. But there are other cases where you can't take the attributes of the parts and assume that with the whole's going to bear the same attribute. So here's some examples. Each atom in this piece of chalk is invisible to the naked eye. That's what they mean. Therefore, the chalk is invisible. No, we can see the chalk with the naked eye. Okay? So what are attributes of the parts, the atoms, is not the attribute of the whole, atoms compositely brought together. Here's one. Sodium and chloride, maybe you should capitalize that, the atomic components of salt are both deadly poisons, and that's true. Therefore, and this should be sodium and actually chlorine, right? For some of you chemical people there, All right, I corrected myself, and I'm more meticulous than you thought. That's just I should have corrected that earlier. Sodium and chlorine, the atomic components of salt, are both deadly poisons. Therefore, salt, sodium chloride, is a deadly poison. No. Sodium and chlorine are poisonous by themselves, but when you put the two together, it's table salt. So these attributes of the part are certainly not the attributes of the whole. So fallacy of composition. But remember, I told you, not every transference of the attribute of the part to the whole is illegitimate. So you need to be careful, because the times that it's legitimate, it's the same analogous type of reasoning. That's why they call them fallacies of grammatical analogy. Here's the legitimate type. Every component in this picket fence is white. Therefore, the whole picket fence is white. That's perfectly fine. White pickets, you're going to have a white fence. There's an argument called the cosmological argument for the existence of God. And there's a part of that argument where the proponents of that argument, who are using it to argue for God's existence, there's a part in that reasoning, and I can't go over all the reasoning right now, where they say, because every single, this is the universe, okay? Every single part or speck of dust or anything in the universe, all the parts are contingent. You can't find anything in the universe that isn't dependent on other realities or entities for that contingent aspect or entity being able to exist. Everything in the universe is dependent on other entities, other processes for its existence. And so the proponents of this argument will argue, therefore, the universe as a whole is contingent. Some will come in and go, hey, you can't do that. Just because the parts are contingent, the whole doesn't necessarily mean it's contingent. You'll get people using this argument saying, here's a case that because every single thing in the universe is contingent, even a speck of dust on the outermost galaxy is still contingent, therefore we feel just fine that it's legitimate to say the entire universe is contingent. And some people will dispute this. Probably the majority will say, if every part is contingent, then the whole is contingent. And if that stands, this would be legitimate, not committing the fallacy of composition. Okay, our last one, and then we're done with chapter 3. The fallacy of division is the exact reverse of composition. Division goes from the wholes to the parts. Committed when the conclusion of an argument depends on the erroneous transference of an attribute from a whole or a class onto its parts. Okay? So you take the attribute of the whole and you say the parts have these attributes. So let's bring up salt again. Salt is a non-poisonous compound. Sodium chloride. That's salt. Is non-poisonous. Therefore, its component elements, sodium and chlorine, are non-poisonous. That's committing the fallacy of division, because sodium and chlorine are poisonous by themselves. This jigsaw puzzle, when assembled, is circular in shape. Therefore, each piece is circular in shape. That doesn't follow, and I don't know, actually I think that's kind of a lame example, but you're getting the point there. Here's another one that I think this example from the book's kind of lame. The Royal Society is over 300 years old, the whole society. Professor Thompson is a member of the Royal Society, a part, right? An element, a composite of that society. Therefore, he's over 300 years old. Okay, and then here's an example where the transference is legitimate. Not every transference here is illegitimate. So again, you got to be careful, because the reasoning move you make is very analogous. This piece of chalk has mass, therefore the atoms that compose this piece of chalk have mass, and that's certainly true, not very much mass. But atoms have mass, and so if the piece of chalk has mass, its component parts have mass, so the fallacy of division is not happening here. Okay, well this ends the fallacies, all of them that we went over in chapter 3. I believe there were 22, and remember, My tips that I gave you when you're going, you've got to get ready for your set number 1 answers and your set number 2 and your test number 2 coming up. And I have a lot of problems in there where you're going to look at arguments and you have to come up with the fallacy. So I gave you some tips. You remember the first one was, don't over or under analyze. Okay? There's a balance. Find the fallacy that's screaming the loudest. Don't get off on bunny trails splitting hairs and pick a fallacy you really shouldn't have because it wasn't the best one. It wasn't screaming the loudest. There's an art to this. You may have it whittled down to 2, but you want to pick the best and the most obvious. The textbook's not trying to trick you. Okay? But you want to analyze enough. If you look at these fallacies, there will be clues. So look long enough, but learn the skill of when you're splitting hairs when you don't need to. The other thing I think I brought up is if you could get that summary. I think at the end of chapter 3 in the summary section, you can print off all the fallacies, get the summary, print it out, okay? So you can have them all there on one sheet and be able to kind of just look at your options there instead of constantly flipping back and forth through the book. Okay, so you guys just remember these things here. Don't under or overanalyze. Remember, if you overanalyze, it doesn't mean you're smart. It means you have a liability. Get the summary printed out because all the fallacies are there in 2 pages that you can get them printed out, and then you can just turn it over, and it just makes it a lot more manageable to do that. Okay, so hopefully all this here helps. Oh, and I remember there was one other tip. I'm just remembering it. Make sure you know the distinctions between fallacies. Between each of the fallacies. Okay? If you get confused on straw man and missing the point, let's say, then you do some work and make sure what is it about straw man that's different from red herring or missing the point. You need to do some work there and you'll be fine. So find out where your troublesome areas are and do some work there. Think it through, and whatever helps you remember how they're distinct, then that's going to help you when you identify the fallacies. And you have to identify a lot from lots of examples, just like the ones in Hurley, and you have to pick out of a multiple choice list. And the multiple choice list, it's you're going to have to go through that and decide which one is the best one. Which one's screaming the loudest. Okay, the next video we'll be starting chapter 4, categorical propositions, and we'll go to some new material. And at this part of the class, it's going to start getting a little bit more quantitative, and this subjective interpretive aspect, it's a skill that's required when you're finding premises, conclusions, fallacies. Chapter 1 and chapter 3, things are going to get a little more exact, quantitative, and less interpretive. Okay? All right.